Today's episode of the Counselling Tutor Podcast is sponsored by Web Healer. You're a counsellor in private practice and you need a website, or you've got an existing website which you need help with. Web Healer are offering Counselling Tutor Podcast listeners, that's you, £100 off the cost of a website design and build. Now, Web Healers specialize in websites for counselors and psychotherapists. It's what they do. And the Web Healer team provide a completely non-technical, done-for-you solution, leaving you to focus your time on your clients. Operating for 20 years, Web Healer are a trusted resource amongst counselors when it comes to getting your practice online. So get the package details and claim your £100 off coupon for your new website by going to counsellingtutor.com/website. That's counsellingtutor.com/website.
Hi, I'm Rory and welcome to episode 311 of the Counselling Tutor Podcast. I'm delighted to catch up again with Sarah Henry, who has a bachelor's in psychology, a diploma in counselling, a level 2 British Sign Language qualification. She's also a race trainer and has twice lectured at the University of Roehampton, lecturing to doctoral students of counselling and psychology on the topic of social justice in counselling. Sarah is also a contributing writer to the book Freeing People from the Medical Model, along with the late Peter Sanders and, of course, the well-known Janet Tolan. Today, Sarah is going to talk about her lecture in our student library, sometimes known as the CSR library, and our CPD library for qualified practitioners, discussing racial identity respectfully. So with that said, let's get on with today's episode.
Welcome to the Counselling Tutor Podcast, the must-listen-to podcast for counsellors, psychotherapists, and counselling students. Here are your hosts, Rory Oakes and Ken Kelly.
Hello and welcome to episode 311 of the Counselling Tutor Podcast. I am Ken, and both myself and Rory are delighted that you've joined us. 3 stops on the journey today, starting with ethical, sustainable practice, where today we're going to be speaking about your personal preparation plan for trauma-informed practice. Do you have one? Well, we're going to be talking through what you may want to consider and think about and what might be in that personal preparation plan. We then move on to our Practice Matters, the CPD section of the Counselling Tutor Podcast. And today it's a lecture that you're not going to want to miss. It's available in our library, and Sarah Henry delivered that lecture. It is outstanding. It's already been reviewed by a number of our members, and it's 5 stars all around. And it's Sarah Henry talking about her lecture that she did for us on racial identity and speaking about racial identity respectfully. It really is worth the listen. You don't want to miss that one. Sarah Henry really moving up, I guess, in the world of counselling and psychotherapy. Rory making a name for herself, and quite rightly so. And then we go into our student services, where we recognise you are students, and today, counselling, confidentiality, and the law. What do you need to know? And this is really important stuff. You don't want to be getting this stuff wrong. So we're going to be diving deeply into that. But let's kick off this episode, Rory, episode 311, with that ethical, sustainable practice, following on with our theme of working with trauma, and speaking today, I guess, about personal preparation plan if considering working in trauma-informed practice, Rory.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think if you are working with trauma, the older saying that we've talked about so often here on the podcast of, hoping for the best and preparing for the worst is never as true as when you're putting together a personal preparation plan, because you never know when you may be triggered, or a story may be so powerful that you can't get rid of it in your mind. And I think there's 2 areas really that this speaks to in terms of theory. One is transference and the other is parallel process. Now, we don't talk a lot about transference on the podcast, do we, Ken?
Every now and then.
every now and then. But transference is where you're in an emotional time machine, where you are in front of somebody and the emotions of a past relationship or a past situation take over you. So you're literally being transported back in time. So a good example is and I may have talked about this in the podcast quite often, is that you meet someone brand new, client for the first time, and all of a sudden you're feeling uncertain, you're feeling anxious, you're feeling nervous, you may even feel scared. And this is a bit of a puzzler because you think, I don't know this person. Why would I feel like that? And then you realize they remind you of someone from the past. And the key phrase here is staying present, because if we're in the past, we're relating to a past relationship. We're working with a past relationship, not the here and now relationship. And if we're working with a relationship in the past, with all the kind of emotions and kind of thoughts and memories of that, we're not really doing the client a service, because we're actually working with another person. We're actually having a conversation with another person in our minds. So if that comes up, always worth saying, this is transference. And maybe it's not as easy to see in the moment. Maybe you go to supervision and you say, I don't like this client. I don't like this client. This client is creeping me out. And a good supervisor will say, does this person remind you of anybody? And the times that certainly in supervision, I've seen light bulbs click on. Oh, it reminds me of, and then the past event, the past person. So that is really important. And also something called parallel process. Now, there's two interpretations of parallel process. There's a classic interpretation by the theorist called Searle, way back in, I think, the early 1900s. And he discusses where you can be hearing the client's story, and what happens is that story reminds you of your story. So an example of that is you're going through a separation. You're separating from your partner, and what happens is the client's talking about a separation, and you can't separate the emotions of what you're going through personally in your personal life from the client's frame of reference. So you're not sure whose emotions you're working with. Is it your emotions, or is it the client's emotions? And that can be tricky. And there's also a more contemporary view of parallel process, which is usually seen in supervision, and that is where you enact out your client's behaviours in supervision. So, for instance, I've worked with supervisors and they've come in and I've said, "How are you today?" "I'm all right." "Okay, and you got anything you want to discuss?" "Might have." I'm being a bit exaggerated here. And you find that the supervisee's effects, in other words, how they're presenting, matches how their clients present. And that can be things like, "I really don't want to talk about it." I've had supervisors who said, "I really don't want to talk about this client." And I've said, "Has this client said to you they don't want to talk about their issues?" "Well, as a matter of fact, they have." So two things to really consider: transference, living in the past, and parallel process, where either you don't know whose emotions you're working with, or you're replicating the behavior of a client in supervision, Ken.
Such important things to consider that are sometimes, as you mentioned, Rory, not visible to the counsellor within the session. And if we go back to the topic is personal preparation plan for trauma-informed practice. And we're delving into some theory. Rory speaking about that transference, that parallel process. So why would we be covering that in a personal preparation plan? Well, it's recognizing that there are things that may kind of show themselves when working with trauma. And it's being aware of who you are. First of all, being aware of the theories that may play out. Being able to recognize how that might play out within yourself, or what telltale signs you may see. So like you mentioned, Rory, I don't like this client. Well, that might be a telltale sign and a good indicator to go to supervision. And this is your preparation plan. You're preparing, if you're working with trauma, and kind of writing this down, being aware of what your triggers are, being very vigilant, are any of those triggers coming up when you're working with someone. And in covering this topic in holistically, I guess what we are going to be doing is touching on some of the groundwork that we've laid coming up to this episode. If you go back over the past few episodes, we spoke about grounding techniques. Well, grounding techniques for you or for your client might be part of your personal preparation plan. It'll be something that you write down, something that you note that when such a situation comes up, I will implement such a grounding technique. And you can go back and listen to the episode on grounding techniques. We'll put a link in the show notes. And of course, that managing transference, parallel process. And I guess, Rory, one of the things we need to consider when we're putting together that the plan is the recognizing the impact of the work that we're doing. You know, we are there as the counselor. We need to be well. We need to be clear and fully present within the relationship and within the moment. Transference, we are not. Parallel process, we are not. And also there is kind of the recognizing that the work can make us maybe fatigued. It can make us irritable. It can give us emotional distancing from our clients. And these are all telltale signs that we might put in our personal preparation plan of what to look out that may play out in us that would indicate in some way that we're not fully serving this client, Rory.
Yeah, absolutely, Ken. And, you know, I guess in any work, certainly where there's a chance that someone might become unwell or hurt, or physically hurt, you would put in some sort of preparation. And as I'm thinking about this, I've come up with a quite an unusual parallel. You know, if you're trained to be a boxer or a martial arts practitioner, you do a lot of groundwork. You do a lot of running. You do a lot of core strength training. You do a lot of practice. You work with a trainer to prepare you for the impact of what is a very physical endeavor. And I think the same mindset, the same thinking is really useful if you're working with an emotional endeavor, you know, to use your trainer, to want of a better word, maybe, you know, that is your supervisor, to prepare yourself and consider what the impact of working with trauma is. It's not easy. As a therapist of, well, quite a few years, I've heard some very, very difficult narratives from clients, some very, very difficult stories. And one of the things I've been eternally grateful for is the preparation that my supervisor helped me undertake. And that was, she was mindful when we met of talking about how many traumatized clients I was working with and how's that affecting me. And sometimes that conversation could be the entirety of a supervision session about how am I taking care of myself? How are you feeling after a week of working non-stop with trauma? What are you doing externally outside your practice? Are you taking care of yourself? Are you spending time with your family, going for walks? Are you doing any hobbies? So important. And in fact, thinking about that, when I went for my first placements interview, the first question they asked me was, do you have any hobbies? That was the first question. It threw me out completely. And clearly on their mind, and they were very experienced people at my first practice. I'll say hi to the people at Tameside and Glossop Mind. Very fond memories of them. They understood the impact of working with difficult presentations, and they wanted to know that as a student, I was I had the ability to be able to absorb the impact, the emotional blows, to use a boxing terminology, of what's going on, and of the work I'd be doing. So preparation is about that. It's about lots of introspection, thinking about your own past, thinking about maybe traumas you've gone through, what triggers you, what difficulties you might come across, and working with a supervisor or maybe even in your own therapy preferably before you meet clients, because then you would have some preparation.
Yeah, definitely. And the key word here is preparation. And you'll notice this is a personal preparation plan. It's about you, the counselor, keeping yourself well. And, recognizing the impact of the work that we're doing, and then making sure, and this is in your personal preparation plan, that you have in place the self-care strategies that are going to be unique to you, the things that kind of re-energize you. And of course, as you mentioned, Rory, the importance of using the support system that is around you as a counselor, and using that also for the unseen, like we spoke about transference, where your supervisor will be helping you look for maybe the unseen, but the seen as well, going in and saying to your supervisor, dare we go in and say to our supervisor, I was seeing a client the other day and they came with a terribly heavy story, filled with immense sadness, and I just didn't feel anything. It's like it didn't impact me. It's like I've got this suit of armor on. Well, it's being able to say those kind of things. And what are the things that recharge you? You put these in your personal preparation plan. So when we spoke about grounding techniques a few episodes ago, we were speaking about grounding techniques that we might share with a client to help them return to the here and now. But there are grounding techniques for you as the therapist as well. I'm going to hold something up, Rory. For those of you that watch our podcast, because we put clips up on Rory, on YouTube. I'm showing Rory a stone, and this stone was given to me by someone that means something very special to me in my life, and they've scratched the word peace on it, and this lives on my desk. And if ever I find myself getting a little bit agitated, or I feel emotions coming up within myself, I pick up this stone, I put it in my hand. It's not a magic stone, but what it does do is it's a grounding technique. It reminds me, it brings me into the present moment. And you might think about in your personal preparation plan, what are the grounding techniques that can bring you as the therapist back into the here and now, if you do feel a little bit of drift when you're working with that very heavy material. And it may be touching an object. It might be the handle on your chair that you go, okay, when I feel that may be happening, I'm going to grab the handle of the chair that I'm sitting on, and I'm just going to start feeling, what does that feel like to me? Feel all the textures of that, and it can bring you back. How do you work in between sessions? Maybe you might put on a little bit of music. I know music works really well for me. I can be carried away with music. It changes how I feel emotionally. It's almost like there's a change of energy when I listen to music. And depending on what the music is, that energy can change in different ways. And then maybe some physical movement between your sessions, maybe getting up after a client has come in, and maybe it's been a particularly heavy session. You might move around and kind of shake off those energies as you prepare yourself for the next client that comes in. And these are just some suggestions. We've got an article on this and a handout that we'll share with you, one of Rory's super duper handouts. In a moment, we'll tell you where to get that. But what the main point here is that you put together a personal preparation plan where you're writing this down and you're considering these before they come up, of how you might act or keep yourself safe and present within the moment. And of course, we've spoken about those self-care strategies that keys in nicely, that support system that we've said, supervision, as you mentioned, Rory. And of course, personal therapy always remains an option to us as therapists. It really does. I mean, we know more than any that going to personal therapy is a strength, not a weakness. It's not somewhere you go where you can't cope and can't do it anymore. It's a place that you can go and grow, and we can grow ourselves. When we recognize that something may be triggering us, or that we're not being present in the way that we feel we could and should, that dipping into personal therapy is a very, very healthy thing to do. I certainly have during my counseling career, and that may be suggested by your supervisor, or you may go to your supervisor and say, that these things are coming up for me. I wonder if I might pop into a bit of personal therapy. And then, of course, the one I really enjoy, and that's peer support, Rory. I mean, we're not the experts on this. We're two peers supporting one another, and discussing topics that we believe are important for therapists and for clients. And I really enjoy speaking with you, Rory, and other peers over the years, and sharing how it is for me, with being a counsellor, because so often we don't get to share it and with our families.
Sure. It can be a pretty lonesome profession, can't it? And also, I think there's no shame in feeling sometimes when you're working with clients a little dysregulated, a little bit, as we say in the north of England, discombobulated, because that's the sense of being human. I'm not going to say that I've worked with clients and I've not been very uncomfortable working with some of the material that's come up, and a number of feelings that have emerged: anger, sadness, in some cases, literally feeling scared with the client. But the key thing is that I know that those processes are only going to be temporary. I know where they're coming from. They're usually coming from the client. And if I feel that any of those processes are not actually coming from the client, they're coming from another place, maybe somewhere in my history, then I know that that's a place either for supervision or, as Ken has wisely observed, your personal therapy. So I guess the message is you don't have to be this kind of bulletproof suit of armor therapist. It's okay to feel a little wobbly in sessions as long as you know where it's coming from and you know that you can regulate yourself. Within trauma communities, there's a quite a wise observation that at least one of the people in the therapy room needs to be regulated, but preferably the therapist. So no shame in feeling those emotions, or it's not a case of you're not doing your job properly or there's some incompetence there, but it's how quick you recover and how quick you could identify where it's coming from, and that you resettle back to your use the term normal, but the way that you function. If it sticks around, if those feelings stick around, then you need to act on them and see where they're coming from and get the appropriate help or advice in therapy, in supervision.
Definitely. And I guess the one last thing that I'd like to mention before we kind of show you where this article is and where you can go and get the super duper handout is the understanding of the cultural contexts of being a therapist. And again, this is about personal preparation plan. So it may involve CPD, engaging in ongoing learning to understand different cultural perspectives. And we've got a great section coming up next on the podcast that is going to really key into that, where we have Sarah Henry, and that you'll enjoy that. Supervision, we've mentioned that as well, going in. And then, of course, personal reflection. How does your cultural background and who you are, the road that you have traveled, how does that influence how you are able to show up within the therapy room? And these are all part of that personal preparation plan. It's understanding self. It's understanding self and kind of what the triggers may be. It's kind of having a safety net, Rory, of the unseen, the transference, maybe some parallel process going on there, understanding that cultural context, recognizing the impact of the work we do, having self-care strategies that are pre-mapped out beforehand that we've thought through and put in place, and then using the support systems to kind of hold that together. And I think that is really informed practice. It really serves the client by keeping us safe and well and present as we can be within those relationships, Rory.
Yeah, it speaks to self-compassion, Ken, because we have to be compassionate with us to ourselves. I think that there's an idea in the world of counselling that we're selfless people, and I think to some extent counsellors are. They give their time hearing very, very, very difficult, sometimes terrifying stories, if I'm honest, to serve another, and it's a calling. It's a calling, and I think that sometimes we need to be compassionate with ourselves and ask the fundamental question, am I okay? Am I okay with myself? Has the material kind of eroded me? Rather like the boxer. Some boxers eventually kind of give it up, don't they, because they're getting beaten up too much. And that's a physical sign that, their careers are coming to an end. I think the same thing goes for therapists in that too many traumatized clients in the week can, without a solid personal preparation plan and a lot of background work, eventually, I think, limit careers and also do untold emotional damage. That's why it's so important to plan, work with your supervisor, work with your peers to get some stability and actively have another life outside counselling, an absolute other life. It's amazing how many people I speak to and they go, didn't realise you did anything else but counselling. And I said, well, I do. It's just that what you hear from me on a day-to-day basis is the work I do. But I've got lots of other things that I do outside of this work. And a majority of those things keep me buoyant, keep me safe. And that's really important. As a therapist, you deserve to be safe and well, and to do the work in a way that doesn't diminish you. So personal preparation plan is all part of that.
Thank you, Rory. And if you would like to read over the really in-depth article on personal preparation plan for trauma-informed practice, you can get the link to that, which includes the link to the handout that you can get for this episode. And you can get that by going to counsellingtutor.com and click on the podcast tab, go to episode 311, that's 311. All of the links will be right there in the show notes, including links to the previous trauma topics that we discussed, because they do build on one another. And that kind of brings us to the end of our ethical, sustainable practice. And we now go into something I'm very much looking forward to today, Rory. You reached out to Sarah Henry. You had a chat with her, and that is all about discussing racial identity respectfully. Now, here's the thing. I know that we've got this lecture both in our CPD lecture library for qualified practitioners. We also have it in our student library because it is a topic that everybody needs to, that will benefit from. But I'm also going to say, if you're not a member of our libraries, we're going to make this lecture available to you for free as well in the same show notes that I've just directed you to. So you go to counsellingtutor.com, click on the podcast tab, go to episode 311. We're going to make this free to attend lecture because it is so important. And of all the feedback, Rory, it's come out with 5 stars all round. What can we expect?
Well, what we can expect, I think, is less heat and more light in a very sensitive discussion about race. And we are a multicultural society. We have been ever since I was a lad, and that was a few years ago. But now different cultures are wanting to be seen as with a distinct cultural identity, which is fair enough. Everybody has a history. Everybody has their own customs. And what Sarah Henry has done is she's produced a series of trainings, and she calls herself a race trainer, where we can sit and respectfully discuss race and our views on our own identity without feeling we're going to offend people, or without sometimes I'm going to be quite bold here, the usual rhetoric of kind of looking at the past and pointing people out and saying it's your fault. This is about very much here and now conversations, keeping in mind the past, but here and now conversations about how we respectfully discuss race. And I think that Sarah, she is ploughing absolutely new ground with this. And I would encourage anybody to watch this lecture because it is so important. And I think that Sarah's work in the next few years is going to be absolutely influential in the way that we develop a respectful dialogue with people from other cultures. So she talked about the lecture. I caught up with her, and this is what Sarah had to say.
Practice Matters is proudly sponsored by the Counsellor CPD Library. To access top quality, relevant continuing professional development for your practice that you can do at a time that suits you and all for less than the price of a cup of coffee, visit counsellingtutor.com.
Part of being a competent practitioner, certainly in my view, is having difficult conversations. And some of those difficult conversations can be about race, which is why I'm delighted to be back again with Sarah Henry, who we met on podcast 298. And if you want to hear that original interview, go to counsellingtutor.com, go to the podcast tab, hit episode 298, and you can hear me and Sarah talk about discussions about race. But she's back today to discuss a lecture she's done for the CSR and CPD Library, discussing racial identity respectfully. So, Sarah Henry, welcome back.
Thank you. Thank you for having me back.
It's a pleasure, and I think we should just start to mean to go on. The conversation about race is as we've discussed many times before, both on the podcast and in our private conversations, about acknowledgement. I'm a white interviewer, white counsellor. You're a black therapist, author, and tutor. And there's the starting point right there, isn't it? The fact that we identify that we are different skin colours and our experience of that may be very different.
Absolutely, that there'll be differences in our experience because of our skin, but also similarities. And that's the important part to point out, is that when it comes to conversations about race, that there can be things that are perceived as different, but when digging down into those, there's actually more similarities than we acknowledge.
Absolutely. And I think from my point of view, not having a discussion about race and being, as you say, and I'm inverting commas in the air, colour blind, isn't perhaps the most helpful way forward. Yes, we want to treat people by, the content of the characters, as Dr. King spoke about all those years ago. I was brought up with the words of Dr. King, rattling around my consciousness. But also it's about acknowledging that with difference becomes different experiences, and how we navigate those conversations, I guess.
Yeah, and that idea of colour blindness, on paper, it sounds like one that's incredibly virtuous, and it can often present itself in everyday scenarios with phrases like, I don't see colour, I just treat people equally. And I can understand the intent behind that, which is about seeking to respect people on an equal playing field. But through removing racial identity as a variable in how people are treated and as an impactful variable, what can then happen is people behave in a way that either upholds or perpetuates discrimination and oppression from a racial perspective, because what needs to be acknowledged is being viewed as irrelevant through a colourblind lens.
Yes, I would totally agree on that. So where do we begin? What is the common ground of a respectful conversation?
The common ground consists of the ability to both share and receive information, which sounds like an incredibly basic way of considering conversation, but it can often be missed. I do race-related work all the time, all day, every day, even when I'm not working. There's always something going on in my mind. And I am somebody that finds it incredibly easy and comfortable to talk about race and to monologue about race. But actually, there can be difficult conversations because a conversation includes more than one person. So it's the ability to both receive the other person's experience without that threatening my sense of self, and to share my experience without being too vulnerable and open to harm. So it sounds incredibly basic, but there's actually real nuanced elements at that, which means that it can become a challenge to have a growthful conversation, particularly in a field like race that's so supercharged with emotion to begin with.
Absolutely. And what kind of fears do you think that people should think about confronting when having these conversations?
I think, Rory, rapidly, that's when we become very frank, you and I. And I share that when it comes to the fears of conversations about race, an individual's racial identity is often what forms that fear. And that is very, very different for you as a white person and me as a black person. But typically speaking, the divide is one between white and non-white people. I use that word intentionally. We may come on to that later.
Yeah.
It's in the workshop why I use the phrase non-white. But my experience is that when it comes to white people entering conversations about race, what they have is a phenomenal fear of offending. And then that can present itself in worrying about saying the wrong thing, hesitating about how to describe, for example, me as a black person, not knowing what things they can and can't say, but also the moral reflection of how they appear and present themselves in that conversation, with the worry about being racist or saying something racist being a direct reflection of their morality as an individual. So all of those fears kind of balled up from a white person's perspective. And from a non-white perspective, when it comes to my experience and my own and what's been fed back, it's the fear of actually not being listened to. It's the fear of daring to be vulnerable and that being exploited and shifted in its focus. So that the pain being diminished because there is a white person whose pain is greater. And then also, personally, it's the fear of nothing changing.
Yeah.
Of doing all of this work and actually in being vulnerable with this person, all I've done is provided them with the tools to cause harm and not to do good, which was my intent in sharing that. So they're the general themes, and those fears, if you consider those in the bodies of two people, they can actually feed each other with the vulnerabilities that are held within people, hence the conversation being difficult but vitally important in the field of race relations.
Yeah, and that's the thing, isn't it? That you picked on the fear. You picked up on the fear of offending, and I guess the emphasis being put on the white person or the light skinned person. That this must be terrible for them. That if they're offended, they must be racist, or they must be this, or they must be that. In any conversation, we can stumble. I stumble in conversations on a regular basis. I've always believed it's about intent. So if you intend to meet the other, whoever that person is, at a relational level, sometimes it will be maybe a bit clumsy, but not engaging in that conversation for the fear that, I might offend and that might be hard for me. Just not acceptable, is it really?
And that's, that divide between the intent and the impact, I think it's really, really important. And sometimes what people can do is that they can assert their intent without understanding it.
Yes.
So I didn't mean that if there was a racist joke that was made, for example. I didn't mean that. Right, okay, but when you actually burrow down into the joke that you made, it was meant to elicit shame.
Yes. And
it was in relation to a racial feature of mine. So with the two of those aligning, that's perhaps how you didn't want me to receive that. But that's a very different thing to what you intended. So the division is helpful if the intent is honestly owned, as I intended in that example I gave. I intended to make a mockery of your racial features. Okay, and that's what my joke was. I didn't intend for it to cause that much pain, which was the impact, but being open to hearing what that impact is and not merely shutting down by saying, well, that's not what I intended, therefore that means that it's not, your experience isn't valid.
Yeah.
So that two-way of not only sharing information, but receiving that and hearing another person's experience as valid in its own right.
Absolutely. And that leads on to the next conversation that people have in cases like that. Well, are you sure you're not being oversensitive? Which just compounds the difficulty and separates people even further. I think this is an important conversation to have, and it's one I enjoy. I know I've enjoyed our off-air conversations. We've found out a lot about each other, and I think it's one that sometimes needs to be explored in the therapy room. As a male therapist, I've often said to my female clients, you know, when they talk about something that's really difficult or abuse that's been perpetrated by a man, I wonder how it is talking to a man about that. And I've actually said to Black Nation people, I wonder what it's like talking to someone who's white about this thing, because what I want to get across as a therapist is, yes, we're working together. There is a difference, and is that difference in any way a barrier from that I'm presenting? And if it is, what can I do about it? That openness I've always found has been reciprocated. Really has.
It's such a misconception that a non-white client needs a non-white therapist in order to do growthful race-related work. I myself worked through my own racial identity with a white therapist, and I was really unapologetic actually about introducing race-related content and saying, do you understand what I'm talking about? My training and my experience as a therapist myself and a tutor meant that I had the confidence to do that.
Yeah.
But if we're working with vulnerable and anxious people to begin with, they may not have the confidence or the courage to assert that from their position. Their position is one that is of the least powerful out of the two in the therapeutic room. So for a therapist to have the courage to acknowledge their own racial identity and to be vulnerable to being rejected by a client who says, actually, now that you've brought that up, I don't think you're the best person to work with me.
Yes. And
to take that as feedback and the opportunity to develop, and not a wounding experience on their substandard racial identity, which it isn't, is a huge step that I think therapists need to take in order to kind of demystify some of these misconceptions that exist in the field. Your client will let you know if they are comfortable working with you or not, but don't leave it to them and their responsibility if you have become aware that there's something incongruent within you that you want to check out, so that you can provide them with the service that they deserve.
Yeah, and I guess conversely, a white therapist beating themselves on the head for the historic wrongdoing isn't going to be very helpful for a client either.
And it's none of the client's business.
No.
They have no idea what any of us have lived before they walk into the room with us. If that's our baggage, then it's important for us to understand on a personal identity point of view why we carry that baggage. Where did it come from? How deeply and intrinsically is it held within us? And what are we doing to at least acknowledge and make sense of that? But to come in feeling like a guilty white therapist in the face of a black client is going to ultimately shift the focus from their development to the therapist preservation. And that's not what any of the training that I've been in or delivered as a tutor, it's not what it's about. No,
if you do feel that guilt, maybe that's a good avenue for therapy to explore that in yourself and make sense of what that is. And one of the things in our many conversations is the little things that sometimes aren't appreciated. So an example of that is recently my grandson fell over and cut his knee. So I went to the back of my car, I got my first aid kit out and I broke it open and I pulled out a plaster and stuck it on his knee. And it was as I'm sticking it on his knee, I thought to myself, that's a plaster that's light skin coloured. It's a Caucasian skin plaster. If I'd had a black grandchild, that would have looked a bit odd on their skin. It would have done the job. It would have stopped the blood flow, which I guess, you could argue that's what first aid's about. But in terms of thinking about just the little things that black or dark skinned people may come across in their life, that really struck me. That really did.
Yeah, it's one of my most favourite examples of the everyday nature of racial identity and the impact that the world can have on us is that there are so many really, really charged and difficult topics to talk about, which can oftentimes be where training starts. When I genuinely believe that a wander around any supermarket will provide enough material to really start to inquire about, right, what does this actually mean? Have I noticed this before? How does it feel for me to even become aware of this now? And it's things like plasters is the number one example for me because they're so mundane.
Yeah, they are, aren't they?
Until you take a deep dive into them and actually realise that the colour has been chosen for a reason, and for that reason doesn't actually exist for everyone in the population. But greetings cards historically have been another one. Where, yes, I could buy a greetings card, a Happy Mother's Day card for my mum, and it would have a white woman on the front, and it would do the job in passing on the message.
Yeah.
Actually, if the roles were reversed, would a white person willingly pick up a card with a black face on and give that to another white person? And so that's where conversations about representation can launch from, but it ultimately starts with having the awareness of, right, okay, in our racialized world, this is where I fit. This is the impact that fit has had on me. And I can appreciate that there are people who are positioned differently in this structure who will either be of more or less benefit because of their own because of what their race means in society. So the plasters, greetings cards, tights, and the colour nude actually is one that really sits uncomfortably with me. All of those things, we all come into contact with them every day, so much so that we probably don't even notice anymore.
Yeah.
But that intentional noticing can actually yield massive amounts of personal information that then shape how we feel when we go into conversations about race.
Yeah. And I guess if I were to go to buy some plasters, I would just pick a set of I bought a first aid kit and I picked it up, didn't think anything about it, popped it in the back of my car, job done. For a black person, that would be maybe going to the chemist and saying, do you sell black plasters or do you sell plasters for my skin? That engages a whole other conversation. So, I mean, I guess if anybody's attached to anybody who makes first aid kits, why don't you stick some black plasters in? Why don't you stick some dark skin plasters? It's not difficult, this, is it? And if anybody complains, say, well, they plasters, and they do the job, but, and the amount of stuff that was in that was effectively just made for light-skinned people. I took my entire first aid kit apart, and the bandages were white. Well, I mean, you could argue that, I suppose, but certainly things like dressings and plasters, all of them for light-skinned people, Yeah,
and things historically like prosthetics.
Yeah.
Everything is geared towards a light-skinned person, and it's white people are the majority in England, so there's no denying that.
Yeah.
But the reality of the world that we live in is one that is, at least from a narrative point of view, focusing on inclusion and equity and representation.
Yeah.
And these are the places where it actually has an impact on people. I myself, it took a long time for me to actually notice from an explicit point of view that plasters were available in so many different styles, but for the colour of my skin. My daughter could have princess ones, and then I had some cars related ones. I had some that were different animal skin textures. There were blue ones, and then there were white skinned ones. So there was all of this consideration for what different groups needed. Children, people that work around food and hospitality with the blue ones. So that consideration had been there, but it had met a limit.
Yeah.
And that limit was for the close to 20% of people that didn't identify as white on the census. 20% of those people were where that limit was met. Right, okay. Well, we can all have a conversation about plasters and how we feel in relation to race and what that relatively mundane product means, but that coming in with that mindset of, well, it doesn't really matter, is then the refusal of receiving somebody else's experience. And that's when the conversation can actually become a conflict rapidly, which it so often can and does.
Absolutely. And as we come to the end of this interview, I wonder what you'd like people to take away from your lecture. What would you like people to, when they finish, what would you like them to go away with?
Well, the takeaway would be that the knowledge that is acquired from books and from TV programs and from training courses in relation to anti-racist practice is only half of the work. And to find a way to have conversations, everyday conversations about race, is what will mobilize that knowledge into something that has meaning. Everyone can do it because everyone has a racial identity. Take the opportunities that the world already has in front of us, and that will ultimately lead to people uniting over racial differences and similarities, rather than being so incredibly divided by them in at least our UK society, where diversity is ever growing.
Mm. Yeah, totally agree. I was going to actually say hallelujah at the end of that, but probably not the greatest thing to say. But I'll say I couldn't agree with you more. The lecture discussing racial identity respectfully is now available in the CSR and the CPD library at Counselling Tutor. Please, I don't often say this, but please, if you're a member or you're thinking of being a member, why not make that your first lecture to go and have a look at? Because it is so important, and it is a conversation that we need to develop, and just so the world's a better place. So it just leaves me to say, Sarah Henry, thank you so much for joining us today.
Massive thank you to Sarah Henry. Thank you to you, Rory, for reaching out, having a chat with Sarah and bringing us that information. And remember, you can watch Sarah Henry's lecture if you're a member of any of our libraries, our CPD library or our student library. Log in. It's going to be right there in your dashboard in the recently released lectures. If you're not a member, we're going to make this lecture available to you free of charge, so you can go and watch that. And to get that, just go to counsellingtutor.com, the podcast tab at the top, and click on episode 311, and the link to access that lecture for free will be right there for you. And that is today's Practice Matters. And we move out of Practice Matters, the CPD section of the Counselling Tutor podcast, and into Student Services. Student Services is sponsored by Counselling Skills Academy. Can't tell you how many times Rory and I have heard counselling students say that learning skills and knowing that they're using them effectively is really, really challenging. The reason for this is because we don't get to see another counsellor using skills in a real live session. In reality, this means that we're asked to learn something that we can never see demonstrated in a real setting, and it's no wonder that many of us are left feeling unsure. If you want to see counselling skills used in real sessions by qualified therapists, so this is real sessions, real presentations, and real use of skills, then go to counselingskillsacademy.com. There's some free videos on skills, including a full live session that you can have a look at. Gain the competence and the confidence of knowing you're using your counselling skills effectively. Just visit counselingskillsacademy.com. And today in Student Services, we continue to recognize you, our students, on that formal journey to become a counselor or a psychotherapist, or just to learn some skills that will aid you maybe in your current work. And today, something really important: counseling, confidentiality, and the law. Now, Rory, I know that this puts fear into some students. I remember when we were discussing it, it was like, why do I need to worry about that? I want to work with clients. I want to work with skills. I want to learn the theories. And now I've got to go and look at this act and that act. Why is this such an important topic, Rory? And what do we need to know?
Well, it's an important topic because when clients come to see us, they expect a degree of confidentiality. They don't want their information discussed on social media or in the pub or at the cinema or at the theatre or wherever people meet. They want to be able to talk about the issues in their life, safe in the knowledge that the person sat in front of them is going to keep their confidence. Now, that's the first point, that confidentiality isn't an absolute and it cannot be guaranteed. So what we have to say, we proceed on informed consent. So what's informed consent? We tell the client what the basis of confidentiality is, and crucially, the exceptions to confidentiality. So a lot of people think that we keep secrets as therapists. We don't. We keep confidentiality, and there's a difference. And speaking solely at the moment within UK law, I mean, there's different laws in different countries. If you're in a different principality, a different country, suggest you check the laws that are applicable to where you're residing. But in terms of the UK, there are two things. One's called an example of legally obliged disclosures, and one is called examples of discretionary disclosures. Now, a legally obligated disclosure means that you have no choice. Under the law, you have to disclose if a client has mentioned certain things. So I'm going to give you three examples and just kind of talk around a little bit. The first is acts of terrorism. So in the very unlikely event, and I think we have to put some real world into this, it's very unlikely that someone's going to sit in his therapy room and say, well, I'm just thinking of, doing some acts of terrorism. Very unlikely that would happen. However, there is a law that says that if someone talks about an act of terrorism, either I'm going to do that or I know somebody who's going to do that, then you're legally obligated to break confidentiality and report them to the police. And also there's a second law that's attached to that, is that you're not allowed to tell them you've disclosed, which is probably quite a good idea. If someone's thinking of doing a terrorist activity, you don't want to be the person to tell them that you're going to tell the police. But also the reason for it is that you shouldn't be tipping off someone who is conducting an act of terrorism to say, I'm going to tell the police. So you're not allowed to tip them off. The other is drug trafficking and money laundering. Again, two things you're probably hardly ever going to see in your practice. So drug trafficking, just to be clear, is someone with a big wagon full of drugs who regularly carries them along and sells them in bulk. We're not talking about someone who buys, some cannabis on a Friday night or a couple of ecstasy tablets. Illegal as it is, I have to say that because we, obviously have to follow the law. But we're not talking about, what we're talking about is bulk movement of trafficking drugs. In other words, bulk movements, being in the business of reselling drugs. And the other is we have to abide by subpoenas. So a subpoena is where a judge issues a diktat to an individual to say, you have got to do this. And you haven't got a choice unless you want to go to court and ultimately go to prison. So what might happen is that they might want your notes, and you might say, well, I'm afraid I can't give them to you. And the police might issue a subpoena. It's a pretty standard thing. It's a bit of a, I don't know, it's a bit of a game, really. Police may come and say, can we have your notes? And the therapist says, you know that I can't give you my notes. They say, we'll get a subpoena, and you go, fine. They get a subpoena, and then you comply. It's just one of those strange kind of dances in confidentiality that therapists sometimes have. And then we have examples of discretionary disclosures. Now, a discretionary is really the therapist's discretion. And shockingly, I think for some people to hear this, child protection and safeguarding, if you're an independent practitioner, so you're working on your own, is discretionary. Protection of vulnerable adults is discretionary, and risk of suicide or serious harm to self or others is discretionary. Now, I'm going to preface that by saying that a good contract, when you contract with your client, you should be thinking about putting these in to your contract. So your client can look at the contract and say, well, if I talk about child protection issues or something about vulnerable adults or harm to self or harm to others, then confidentiality be broken. The idea is that a client shouldn't be surprised or say, well, he never told me about that if you break confidentiality. So discretionary and, I guess, legally or mandatory disclosures. I suggest that anybody who's worried or thinking about the law, we're going to put a link into the show notes for the BACP's fact sheet or information page, which talks about this. So have a look. And also, if you're a student in practice, then speak with your supervisor. If you are just writing an essay, then really the essays should be around legally obligated disclosures and examples of discretionary disclosures. Those are the two real areas that someone who's marking an assignment should look at. One final thing, I think, if you are students in practice, don't act impulsively without consultation. So before you think of breaking confidentiality, speak to someone at your practice manager or your supervisor. Just don't do it straight away. If someone says something and you go, I'm going to have to break confidentiality, talk it through. Unless it's an emergency, someone actually says, I'm going to leave here and take my own life. In that case, then really you've got to act immediately. But it is quite complex. And I think for those coming into training, it can feel very, very complicated and a bit scary, Ken.
Can indeed. There's a lot that you've covered just there. I just want to put some brackets around everything that Rory has said. We're based in the United Kingdom. We're talking about the law in the United Kingdom when Rory is kind of quoting where we need to break confidentiality. That's here in the UK. So if you're outside of the UK, you'd want to really be having a look at what are the laws that govern confidentiality for you and your clients. And there are many countries where child protection is a mandatory disclosure. So we're speaking only here in the UK on that one. And you started with this, Rory. I said, what's the reason for it? Well, I'm going to chip in here and say we legally keep confidentiality because it is the law, and we have to break confidentiality when we are mandated to. But also, one of the biggest reasons for complaint against you as a professional are around confidentiality, and it's not the breaking of confidentiality. It is maybe the misconception that a client may have of coming into therapy and thinking anything that they utter or say within the within therapy is a secret, is kept confidential. And of course, most of it is. It's a cornerstone of therapists and client relationship. It builds that trust. But we have to clearly outline before we start the sessions within our contract and verbally, and gain informed consent. In other words, getting the client's signature and a date that they understand and agree to what we are speaking about. And it's interesting, in the news right now in France, the CEO and founder of an app called Telegram, which is a private messaging app, has been arrested and detained, is out on bail now as we make this podcast. And the reason for that is that there was messaging around drug trafficking and money laundering that took place on the Telegram application. And when the police investigated and asked for those notes to be handed over, they were not handed over. The CEO said, no, this is a private messaging platform. We're not handing that over. And he was jailed for that. And that is the end point of this. It's breaking the law if we don't work within it and break confidentiality where we must. And I guess there's misconceptions out there that may lead a client into thinking that you can speak about anything in therapy. And I'm thinking about a television series that I used to watch back in the day, Rory, called The Sopranos. And this was about a mafia family. And part of it, part of the formula of this was that the mafia guy boss would go to his therapist on a weekly basis and get all the stuff off his chest, because this was a confidential place. Well, that is not true. Certainly not here in the United Kingdom. You couldn't do that. Yes. But it you don't know what the references of your clients coming in. You may have studied and know this stuff, but without it being in a contract, without the informed consent of your client, with them knowing exactly where you need to break confidentiality, you can fall foul of the law, or you can get a complaint laid against you with your professional body because there was a misunderstanding about where that was. And I guess this is not really the law, but it does fall into discriminatory, where you kind of may or may not break confidentiality. You're not mandated to. There are certain agencies where, when working within the agency, they will have times that you need to break confidentiality that are not maybe reasons that you would put in your own private practice, but they are when you're working within that agency, and that also needs to be taken into consideration because they'll have their reasons for why that is done as it's done, Rory.
Yeah, so one final observation is, if you're listening in the future to this podcast, check the law as it stands in the timeline you're in. So if you're listening, this has been recorded and broadcast in September of 2024. If you're listening in 2026, check the information, because almost certainly at least one of those discretionary laws that we talked about, that of child safeguarding, will almost certainly by 2026, that's my prediction, be mandatory. Ken's alluded to it being mandatory in all European countries, and I think that's pretty much the case. It's not in the UK, but there's legislation going through Parliament now that would make it mandatory. But at the point of recording and broadcasting, it's not. So if you're listening in the future, or you're listening at any time, check. Go to your professional body's website, check. Speak with your supervisor, check. Speak with your agency, and check. Because laws change. And I think at least one of those laws, the child protection law, will be changing quite rapidly, Ken.
Yeah, and if you go back to the last episode of the Counselling Tutor Podcast, episode 310, Rory and I were speaking about getting your reading list in order in student services, and one of the bits of guidance was, if you're buying books on ethics and the law, buy the most up-to-date copy of that, not a past edition that was maybe published 3-4 years ago, because as you've alluded to now, Rory, it's changing all the time. And a recent change, which does actually deal with the law, and it deals with counselling, and it deals with our clients, and it deals with informed consent, is the information that we hold on our clients, just their name, their address, their telephone number, how that is stored. The UK GDPR, General Data Protection Regulation law, suggests how that can be collected, how it is stored, that we have to have informed consent about it. So it's interesting when we speak about consent and confidentiality, just the client's name and details are confidential, and we need to keep them so, and we need to protect them. So there's a lot to consider, and I think definitely a topic to ponder on. If you are a qualified practitioner, maybe time to get the old contract out and have a reread over that, and just see is that as up to date as it needs to be as the law changes and as the guidance changes. I guess we're called upon to pull out the contracts and make them relevant for the law to which we work today.
Indeed, Ken. And I think it's all part of good practice. And as I say, if you want the link to the BACP's current information, and the BACP are only echoing information that other professional bodies would endorse and promote, then if you go to Counselling Tutor, the website, go to the podcast tab, look for episode 311, and you'll find the current link to the current guidance. Have a look at it, and then have a look over your contract and see if the two match. It's so important.
The National Counselling and Psychotherapy Society, or NCPS, proudly sponsor this podcast, supporting students every step of the way. Join the NCPS for resources, training, and a friendly, knowledgeable community to enhance your learning experience. Visit ncps.com. You've been listening to the Counselling Tutor Podcast, episode 311, Rory.
We have, or you have, and we start with ethical, sustainable practice, and we talked about that very important and essential personal preparation plan for trauma-informed practice. Don't forget, there's a webpage and a handout for that by going to episode 311 at counsellingtutor.com. We met up in Practice Matters with the fabulous Sarah Henry, who's really ploughing new ground, and that free lecture on discussing racial identity respectfully. Must-watch lecture, and a must-watch person, in my view, who's really ploughing new ground in those difficult conversations regarding race, identity, culture, and how we're respectfully engaged. And then finally, in student services, we looked at counselling, confidentiality, and the law. We tried to weave our way through the maze of different laws and disclosures, and what therapists really need to know, students especially, but obviously those who are qualified. Finally, a bit of a plea from the heart. If you've enjoyed this episode, or you're a regular listener and you've enjoyed the episodes that we produce, why not give us a review on your podcast platform? That could be iTunes or Podchaser or wherever you go. And why don't you share the information on your social media platforms, LinkedIn or Facebook or whichever social media platform you have, so that we can we could get our message out and share this information. And thank you to all those people who've left fab reviews and told us just how much help the podcast is to them. And finally, and as always, stay grounded and stay safe.
Take the stress out of your counselling studies and get the support of Rory and I by joining us in the Counselling Study Resource. Counselling Study Resource, or CSR for short, is the world's most comprehensive assignment guidance and study support resource for students just like you of counselling and psychotherapy. See how Counselling Study Resource can help you. Visit counsellingtutor.com. That's counsellingtutor.com.
Thank you for listening to the Counselling Tutor Podcast. Find the show notes for this episode by visiting counsellingtutor.com.